Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Jams and Tea film discussions, where very occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, as we are wont to do, we discuss a film that members of this podcast and the extended podcast family have thoughts and feelings on, and we basically roundtable it and talk about what's so significant about the movie to us, maybe some aspects of the movie that haven't necessarily been talked about or appreciated enough in the discourse, and yeah, try and give you a kind of jams and teified encapsulation of our perspective on a movie, particularly in this instance, a movie that might be on the more divisive side potentially. And you as a viewer might be approaching this video with your own preconceptions or thoughts or ideas about the movie and your own feelings. And so if you agree or disagree with the things we have to say, we'd love to hear from you. But let's sort of lay a bit of groundwork in that the four of us are all, to varying degrees, big Matrix fans, big enjoyers of the Matrix original film and the original sequels to varying extents as well, as we'll get
or
into.
average Matrix enjoyers.
And also, we were all very excited for this sequel, particularly hearing that Lana Wachowski was on board. Sadly, only Lana, not Lily as well, but still, I think the confirmation that Lana would be helming this essentially and co-writing it along with David Mitchell, I believe, whom she co-wrote, who wrote Cloud Atlas, the book that she and her sister adapted almost a decade ago now. So
one of the greatest books of all time.
So here we are then with The Matrix Resurrections itself, the fourth and long-awaited, well, not necessarily long-awaited because it only really existed as an idea very recently, but once it was announced, the anticipation was pretty heavy. So let's sort of start by digging into what this sequel, why the sequel even exists in the first place, right? Because Lana and Lily were pretty adamant for a while, once they'd finished Revolutions, that was really all of the story that they wanted to tell. And they weren't particularly keen on revisiting this world. They expanded and made several fantastic and beloved films in its wake. And yet here we are back to square one, or back to building on square one at least. So I'll open this to the floor, and anyone who wants to kind of jump on this is welcome to. Why does this movie exist?
I think the easiest answer is that Warner Brothers felt that there would be a market for it. And that's a pretty simplistic, viewpoint, which is just to say that we exist in a world where nearly everything has been brought back from the 1990s, particularly, but beyond that decade as well with, we have like a Ghostbusters movie that came out this year. But when we look at Jurassic World and Logan and the Disney Star Wars films, there's a huge marketplace for these sort of legacy movies that look back at an old franchise, particularly when you can get previous actors back into their old roles, like we see with Keanu Reeves and Carrie-Ann Moss in this film. But what's unique about it is that unlike almost every one of those movies, we actually have Lana Wachowski back in the director's chair and back writing this film, which I think is what makes it somewhat captivating, because they actually managed to get one of the two individuals that was directly responsible for the creation of this back to kind of look through the lens of the way that all of these types of legacy movies explore that text from the present tense, looking backwards on it, except from the perspective of that film's creator. And I think that by doing that, you actually end up with something that's, I think people have already made the comparison to like Wes Craven's New Nightmare, where there's somebody kind of returning to the director's seat that is interested in the metatextual representation of like what it was like to create the original thing and what it is like to be the creator of something that is so important to people that we want to return to it, and exploring why that is interesting. And so I think that that's kind of the creative driving force of why this film exists and why Lana particularly chose to come back to it, because she wanted to, I think, explore the idea that you cannot have the Matrix without Lana and or Lily Wachowski. And that's a point to kind of unpack later in our conversation. But that's what I greatly took away from this, is that in a particular way, this film is all about how none of this exists because of the icons. It exists because of the people that made it and because of the people that it is about, which is what this movie is all about.
And it goes even deeper than that as well, because like on that metatextual level, like the Matrix as an intellectual property, like is this piece of media that has sort of grown and like you know, become so much bigger and beyond the control of Lana and Lily Wachowski in the intervening years since those movies were initially released. Like what the Matrix is, like what iconography of the Matrix has come to represent, like the cultural space that the Matrix occupies. It is constantly a text where meanings are imposed onto it at the whim of, you know, the culture or of whoever. And so the Matrix as an intellectual property, like since that initial trilogy was made, has blown up and expanded and kind of become this unwieldy beast that, again, reading into this a little bit, but I think that Lana makes this fairly explicit with the Matrix Resurrections. There's a sense that this creation, which, as you say, could not exist without the Wachowski sisters and is so deeply personal to them, has essentially, you know, gone entirely outside of their control, as a piece of art may well do. And as an artist takes the risk of, or as an artist kind of accepts the possibility of when they make it. But there is a sense that it's escaped them so much that taking this responsibility of making this on, because essentially Warner Brothers, as I understand it, Warner Brothers presented the idea that we're going to continue the Matrix story with or without you. We're going to continue the Matrix story. We'd love for you to be involved, I'm sure was what the conversation, how the conversation went, right? And so there's this need and even personal responsibility to helm that, to take control of that, to try and bring the Matrix back to where it started, to try and bring that personal significance and vision for this idea, this world, back to where it began, and to try and kind of seize some of the agency over it from the, you know, just massive mess that people have made of it in a certain sense.
You know, you say getting into the weeds about it or like looking too deeply into it, but the thing is that the movie tells you this in no uncertain terms, in that there are several characters or lines of dialogue that are just very explicitly Lana just being like, hey guys, guess what? And look,
I mean, there's not even the fucking slightest attempt to hide it all. Like, there's literally like
Matrix is about crypto fascism.
There's
it's
literally a line in this movie where it's like Warner Brothers want to make another Matrix.
I mean, like, genuinely, one level, like, I feel like this could get dismissed as being like kind of a hokey, kitschy idea, but it's like, when I really look at, like, when I take a step back and look at what the Matrix Resurrections ended up being and what Lana did with it, is that, like, it sounds kind of broad to say that I think that this movie is about meaning, but I think it is really in more of a technical sense, that I think that it's about labels. It's about names. It's about identities. It's about, like, the inherent dissonance of seeing a character who you've seen portrayed as in 3 movies as this iconic person, and then suddenly they're a completely new actor. And sometimes there are other actors who are returning from them. Maybe they look different. And there's a sort of an uncanniness to this film's aesthetic that I really feel like falls in line with that. This is a very, like, aesthetically speaking, it's a shinier, very, like, calculated kind of aesthetic that feels a little bit divorced from the original Matrix trilogy. Not totally, but enough to feel different, to feel new, to feel sleek. And that sort of, like, dissonance and the embrace of the uncanny and almost like well, I mean, you could borderline just like the dissonance is, it evokes a kind of dysphoria. Is sometimes there's so many moments where characters in this movie look into mirrors or like see different versions of themselves and other things, and it's like it's all about how everything is fractured and taken. And the way that, like, the broadest way I can classify my affinity for this movie and what I think is so brilliant about it is that it's Lana definitely taking back and reclaiming it and doing it as this legacy sequel, but from the person who made it originally and understood it. And I wouldn't even say that she's like remaking the Matrix. She's clarifying the Matrix, stripping a lot of the aesthetic choices and the innovativeness of those movies back, and kind of telling the core story. Like, everything that's here is that a lot of people are sort of like, a lot of the dissonance with the reception of the movie is that some people are just like, oh, it's so different than the other movies, and it's like mainly a love story, and it's like really focused on Neo and Trinity and stuff, like not quite to the in a way that the other ones weren't. And in my opinion, at least, it's sort of like her taking that and being like, okay, but like, this is what was important about those movies to begin with. Were you not paying attention? And this elaboration upon that theme allows her to come back with everything that she's learned since. And in my opinion, at least, and the opinion of a few other people I know, do it a little bit better, do it a little bit more confidently. The core of the story. I know you can latch onto the aesthetics and the things that the original Matrix movies do that makes them notable and nostalgic and innovative and awesome, but this feels like the soul of those movies. In fact, if I had to pick anything, it reminds me of Revolutions the most. This feels like them sort of like able to refine down to what the nitty gritty really was, what this story always felt like, the emotional core of it, and it capitalizes on that beautifully, in my opinion anyway.
I want to talk really briefly, because Jake mentioned the aesthetic of this film and comparing it to the original trilogy. It is a lot more sleek, but I think that there's a purposefulness narratively to the sleekness, which is interestingly juxtaposed with the usage of clips from the original trilogy, which form a really jarring stylistic contrast when you look at that 35 millimeter work print of any of those three original movies, and then you compare it back to this. There is a really jarring stylistic difference, but what it communicates to me is twofold. One, that we are part of the same narrative continuity as that, and two, that the style evolution, I think, represents a progression beyond that because of that, if that makes any sort of sense. As in, the technical innovation of those films was a necessary link in the chain to get us to this more interesting and cohesive visual place that is a bit, in my opinion, more in line with the Wachowskis as they have been post The Matrix, when you look at a film like Cloud Atlas or a television series like Sense8. And I think what's really significant about that, and you compare it to Revolutions, is everything in the real world in this movie looks fucking incredible. And I'm talking about like the city of Io and the pods. All of that stuff looks better than it ever has. And therefore, the integration of the two visual styles, which was always kind of a sticking point for people in that original trilogy, is way more seamless now. And that is reflected in the nature of the story, that there is a greater level of integration between the humans and the machines.
There's a canonical explanation for why it looks like this. I mean, if you hold up the one of the last shots of Revolutions, which is the city skyline as the sun comes up over it, it purposefully looks way different than the murky green saturation of any sequence in that city in the trilogy beforehand. And I think what immediately comes to mind is the first shot of the trailer for Resurrections, where it's the San Francisco skyline, and it's the analyst's building, and the sun is coming up over the skyline almost exactly like it did in one of those last shots.
You see those birds kind of fly in that pattern, which you see a few different times throughout the film.
Another sort of evidence to add to this sort of like the context under which this was made is the cinematographer for this movie has stated in interviews that she wanted to make parts of this movie like, oh, hey, do you want me to make this look more like the other three movies? And Lana was like, no, this is its own thing now. Don't make it look like that. I want this to be this.
I think there's a specific relevance when we look at, people forget this because the color grading of that original 1999 film has been kind of dorked around with all the physical releases. Yeah. But the original color grade of that movie is not very green tinted until it kind of gets to the end. The sequels are green tinted. And what that kind of represents is Neo's burgeoning awareness of like the falseness, the illusion of the Matrix, which is gone here. And in addition to that, there are reasons within this film, which I think that we'll just avoid spoiling, that literally explain why this Matrix, the Matrix represented in this film, is different looking than the Matrix represented in those films. There's multiple reasons for it, thematically and in terms of the interior logic of the film. Also, just my opinion, I think it looks amazing. I love when movies have colors in them.
Yeah.
I mean, like, even the overly sanitized part of the aesthetic of the movie looks fucking gorgeous. It, like, all of it is edited, like, it's pristinely presented in a way that doesn't sacrifice the visual accessibility of the film while still being like really strong stylistically. And I personally will just fucking love that about the movie. And not to mention just fucking like the sort of in-universe explanation for why it looks the way it looks also just kind of adds to the whole like layer upon layer upon layer of what makes this movie smart. And the sort of changing the color grading and like everything about this world feels more accessible and like smarter. And it really gives you the impression that the machines evolved since the first Matrix to better trick people into thinking that this is the real world. By abandoning that green tint and embracing something sleeker, it's showing you that the machines are getting better at their job.
Yeah, and it's also like one of the things that's so beautifully satisfying about sitting down and watching this is the way that it uses the visual language and just general look of like modern like 2010s blockbusters, and then throws the gigantic fucking Wachowski, movie under that lens, right? Like it's beautiful to see a Matrix that feels of this time, because one of the quite facile sort of like comments that I've seen that have been made is sort of that, and I think there's sort of some kind of cultural truth to this, or like something you can kind of dig into here, which is that the Matrix as a series, as a film, as a cultural property, very much feels like of its time. Like this is a late 90s, early 2000s piece of kind of like futuristic sci-fi that is very much rooted in that era. And so the danger,
flip phones, sunglasses,
the danger or like the consideration you have to make when making a new addition to that series in 2021 is, are you going to harp that aesthetic, or are you going to try and bring this into the present? And how are you going to do that? How are you going to make that feel organic and real? And I think Lana does an amazing job of, with all of the techniques that have already been mentioned by you guys, of making this story feel like it belongs in 2021, like it fits in the current era, like it looks immaculate, like it fits within the aesthetic of what you've come to expect, modern blockbusters to look like, and then does so much that is more subversive, more original, more exciting, and more just genuinely emotionally gratifying than a lot of those movies actually do. So that is the most immediately satisfying part of experiencing the Matrix Resurrections for me, is seeing the way that Lana has pulled that off, the way that Lana has made a film that not only justifies its existence as in continuing a story that has long been finished, but actually in making something that actively adds to the legacy in ways that are interesting and relevant, and updates a lot of the terminology and subtext of that time to the current era. If anything, makes it feel only more relevant without, being too like on the nose about that either. And so it's just a very, very deftly negotiated the way that this movie updates so much of the world of the Matrix for 2021.
I think the visual style, very briefly, reminds me a lot of Spielberg's AI, where it's a movie that takes the sensibility of contemporary blockbusters and the sensibility visually of its director, and then weaponizes it across a story that is very much about the dangers of nostalgia, that somewhat inspects, as Jake was kind of teasing out, why it's dangerous that the Matrix looks more visually beautiful and less kind of ugly and green. And it's because there's a bit of a danger to the force of love and optimism and hope, like the way that those things can be kind of turned against the characters. And I think that it's just kind of a parallel between how Spielberg was approaching his blockbusters in the early 2000s stylistically, to kind of take these things that look very beautiful but are ultimately kind of tainted, I guess, which is a lot of what the Matrix is.
The word I come back to a lot.
Yeah, uncanny is a great word for it. You know, this is a movie where Morpheus and Agent Smith kind of get fused into one personality. It's kind of taking positive, negative, false dichotomies and then like melting them down into something that seems contradictory, but ultimately the contradiction is its essence. Machines cooperating with people.
I think it's important to clarify why Lily Wachowski is not involved here, because she's talked about this publicly, and they both have. Lily's perspective is that they had just come off of Jupiter Ascending and Sense8 and a whole slew of other projects, and she was essentially burnt out. But I think the biggest reason for not returning to this property specifically was they had come, or Lana had come up with the idea for Resurrections, something like in between the 5 weeks difference when their parents died. Like I think one of their, I can't remember which one, but one of their parents died, and then 5 weeks later the other one died, and the idea was sort of forged in between that time, I think. And from Lily's perspective, going back and exploring these specific characters, Neo and Trinity, specifically resurrecting them, was something that she, and like, I can't find the exact quote that Lily said, but it was something like expressly unappealing to describe going back to the Matrix, in specifically in a time of great grief. And Lana has also talked about this, and from her perspective, it was basically the exact opposite. She found the idea of returning to Neo and Trinity, specifically two characters that had passed on, and bringing them back. She found a lot of solace in that. And I feel like so much of that bleeds through in the way that this film expresses its love for its characters and how the two main characters express their love for each other. There's a dedication towards the end of the credits. It says "for mom and dad," and it fucking hits like a train.
Mm-hmm. You can also sort of take that a little bit further, I think, is that like they do explicitly be like, oh, there's like the first 30 minutes of this movie is the most heavily meta oriented part of the film, which I mean I personally really enjoy. I think it's handled pretty deftly. It's like there's no mistaking what this part's about, but it's also not so overbearing that I feel like it becomes cheap or annoying. But the cool thing about it is that honestly, when I like look past all of it, there's like that mention of like, oh, the boardroom suits are talking about, oh, it's about this, it's about that, it's about trans politics. That's a line in the movie. And like, it's not that she's getting at people for finding these underlying themes in the movies. It's just that it's really more that it's a bunch of suits in a room pigeonholing the Matrix for it's just one thing. Like it's just this set in stone concrete metaphor, blah, 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 which is why I think this movie is so inherently flexible with its metatext. It's like a complete opposition against that. But it also, like, in terms of like, you know, you can talk about the parallels to the transness of the original Matrix trilogy. And if you want to extend that a little bit, which is something that I think is really more subconscious about those movies rather than conscious, and I think they've said as much. I think here that the subconscious extension of that is the idea of, and I've read a lot of pieces on this movie, so it could just be that them informing this, but one aspect of it is sort of like the idea of at least for trans people, a lot like a really shitty thing that people have to like worry about right now was the idea of detransitioning, where society or the people around you basically force you back into the closet and you just kind of have to go back to the way things used to be. And I really feel like that's kind of the angle that they're attacking Neo with here, is that it's like he's reintegrated, he's within the Matrix again, and they've sort of like shoved him away from the fact that, you know, he gets to break into the real world in those other movies, but now he's back here again. And it's like there's so many different lines of this movie where it's just like everybody convinces you about something, even though you spent your whole life knowing one true thing about yourself, and then they came along to make you question it. Yeah. And it really feels like that's sort of the emotional heart of the movie, is sort of realizing what you are despite the world telling you you're something else.
And of course, the basis for having the central villain be a character like the Analyst, played very memorably by Neil Patrick Harris in a quite blunt, but I think pointed for the reasons you've said, jab at a lot of psychotherapy, and specifically, but I don't think necessarily...
Was that triggering for you, Neo?
I don't even think necessarily an explicit jab at that, but more just at the things that you've been saying, Jake, about like the ways in which, you know, people are told how they are or how they should feel or what they should do by people who don't necessarily understand nor necessarily have the best intentions with regard to that experience.
It's just a representation of how systems of control are still authoritative and violent, even when they have a nice face. Even when they seem like a nice little queer guy with cute glasses and a nice cat, and he's there and he speaks in calming tones and he's there to reassure you and make you feel good about yourself, it's still a system of control. And that's ultimately like the anti-authoritarian streak that runs through every single Lily and Lana Wachowski film, including this one. I think that I wanted to touch on that opening 30 minutes, which I agree are kind of the most burdened with the metatextual elements and burdened with explaining where things are now. However, I think that anyone that's sort of reducing that to just like something that you have to slog through is missing a lot of what it's establishing vis-a-vis the new status quo of what the Matrix is.
Yes.
And in particular, how that connects to a character who returns from the Matrix Revolutions, who is in the very beginning of that film. Because ultimately this film and that film begin in a very similar way, where Neo has been kind of trapped by the system. And what we're observing is his desire, particularly in this case for Trinity. I think always pretty much with Neo, that's the desire. But it's observing how human behavior is about emotion. It's about what we want. It's about choices that we don't have to make because we understand what matters to us, which is what the entire rest of the film is about. And you wouldn't have that without kind of establishing that what this movie is suggesting that control and systems of authority evolve to kind of, you know, constantly combat. And that's any kind of space opera, fantasy type of thing that the Matrix has always been about, like the forces of good and evil. And in this case, like how they evolve and where those lines shift. Particularly, I think what this movie does a kind of a cool job with is like with the character of Smith, who is still pretty clearly Smith and antagonistic and, you know, evil perhaps, but he kind of forms his own third party will where he aligns with who he needs to align with at the given moment. And I think that there's a little bit of a cool metatext there too, because he ultimately stands up to the analyst who represents kind of like the broader world of people, whereas Smith represents an original creation of Lily and Lana Wachowski. So even though he represents something kind of negative and bad in that story, he is still like part of like the OG. He's like, an original creation. He isn't something that was created dispassionately. He was an important part of the thematic, emotional, and narrative design of that story. And thus his connection to it is critical. And Jonathan Groff, I think, does a great job of realizing that character. And I think so does Yahya Abdul-Mateen, who deserves a lot of credit because Lawrence Fishburne's shoes to fill are incredibly large. And I think that he does a great job. And I think that Lana Wachowski does a really great job of writing that character to be its own distinct entity that provides like a lot of really interesting science fictional implications within like the lore of the Matrix, if you're into that kind of thing, which I am, where you have this kind of...
Okay, I am too.
it's like a sentient program that can like move in between the Matrix and the real world. And like, it's just kind of this evolution of the concepts that drive the Matrix, you know, outside of its emotional and thematic nature. It is also just a really fucking cool science fiction movie. And like, you know, that explores how consciousness, love, and transhuman philosophy kind of relate to artificial intelligence and machines and simulations, which I think is great. I think that's always been right at the center of these
which
films.
Is also like, you know, I'll just say this really quickly, reflected in the fact that in this movie, machines and humans have a more harmonious relationship than they had in the original trilogy as well. Like that's almost a throwaway detail, but it's almost like
which is something that they address in the original trilogy. Like in Reloaded, they have whole conversations about how like humans are dependent upon machine function, and that it presents kind of a complex thing.
Whereas here, the coexistence between I forget the names of those two cute little machines, but they're like,
it's like Sabibi
was one of them, yeah. And
it's
but they're
so
like
cute.
They're not like servants, nor are they like, you know, they're just friends. Like they're presented as a part of the family, and that I think is quite a pointed detail.
I just want to note very quickly how much fucking internal hooting and hollering I did when Jonathan Groff's first lines were fucking billions of people living out their lives. I was just like, yeah.
It's even better too, is because he immediately like acknowledges that, and it sort of feeds into what I was saying about the Matrix being smarter. Is that like one of my favorite things about the movie is Jonathan Groff as Smith, and it's for reasons that I feel like a lot of other people who are nostalgic to this franchise might like not dig, because like there's even a point where like a character just sort of is like, oh, Neo Smith facing off, oh my god, they're like, you know, like they have some sort of like basically pretending as if they're just pure embodiments of good and evil, and them clashing is like, you know, this mythic thing, when in fact they were really just two different characters who had two different motivations that clashed against each other. And this movie takes that to its logical extreme with Smith, who honestly I feel like doing like, if I can look back at the other movies in retrospect, is that they kind of just sort of finish the story in Revolutions, and it's just like, oh, you know, Neo beats Smith, but like there's a thing about Smith that's just sort of like, he sort of reaches a point where he can't understand, and I really like how this movie elected to elaborate upon that, and that like the fact that he ends up kind of being a third party objector that's separate from the analyst, separate from Neo, it goes to show the sort of inherent grayness that like nothing is really like the broadly good and evil tones that a lot of people might want to paint this as. But he kind of steps away from it and becomes his own creation, which is perfect when you recast somebody like Jonathan Groff as Smith, who frequently pokes fun by doing a fucking impersonation of Smith, which is funny, but also I just love how much of a fucking bastard he is in this movie. Like he loves every single second he is on screen in this. Like when they show up at that thing that's like right before the fight scene with the Merovingian, he's just like sitting on a pole wearing like some fucking Aeropostale shit,
and like a really shiny pair of Ray-Bans.
Yeah, he's just like, hey guys, how's it going? And you're just,
he's like a very
this
Hollister
motherfucker
Sperry's fucking version of
it's like he's learned how to be his own kind of villain, in that it's just like before he was just like, he broke away from the Matrix, he became an individual, but he didn't have that purpose that Neo had, which is sort of why they clashed to begin with. And here he actually finds his purpose into being like, this authoritarianism thing is something that I, as like an individual who was brought up in this system, am fundamentally opposed to. So the enemy of my enemy ends up being my friend in his case. And I mean, on one hand, that's like, yeah, Jonathan Groff's, yes, Jonathan Groff's take on the character is so much more like blended and different, and it's why his recasting works as a whole. But it's also the through line of it is that he's having just as much fun as Hugo Weaving was having in that role. Like whenever he shows up, he's not even in a lot of the movie, but whenever he shows up, you can just tell he was having a ball with every single line reading, which I kind of get that from most of the people in this movie, which is kind of why like Morgan in one of his write-ups for Letterboxd said that one of the distinct strengths of this movie is that it's joyous to watch. And I agree with that wholeheartedly, is because the original three Matrix movies, not that this is an inherently bad thing, they're very dour, very self-serious movies that have a very, very dire tone about them. Even in their cool moments, it's still like, oh, this is life or death. I just really appreciate how there's so many ways that this could go wrong. There's so many, like, especially with Mitchell as a writer too, is that my biggest worry about this is that it would go up its own ass. But it really doesn't. It just kind of saves it for the part of the movie that's necessary to its overall concept. And then eventually it gets that stuff out of the way so that you can you have an idea for the scene. You kind of know the ins and outs, which again, the first Matrix movie did exactly the same thing, except it did a lot more of that. So I really don't understand why it's a problem all of a sudden that the movie's doing that. But I guess we've just forgotten everything since 1999. But whatever. The real point that I'm making here is that this movie feels as though it is both critical of itself, critical of the people who enjoyed it. You kind of have the Matrix fanboy character who kind of likes it for all of the reasons that, some toxic internet fuckboy would like it. And then you have Bugs's gang of people who really feel like actual Matrix fans, metatextually speaking. And it's just sort of like, oh, these are the people that kind of got on the wavelength of the movie and kind of understood what Lana and Lily were doing. And then there's this other one guy who's just like, I like it when the guys shoot the guns and fucking shit because it's cool and stuff. And that kind of playfulness and the meta here it's very Wes Craven-y. It's very New Nightmare. But for me, this works in a way because it has the same sense of stakes that New Nightmare doesn't really like elaborate on or focus on. So you're kind of like left up in the air, just being like, I don't really know how much of this is dramatically relevant to what's happening, but okay. Whereas everything here is dramatically relevant. It's why I think the screenplay is so fucking tight for a 2.5 hour long movie.
The original trilogy feels dire because it is presenting itself as somewhat of a hero's journey where Neo is the one and Smith is the zero. And what this movie clarifies, has always been true, is that not necessarily. They were just two guys. They had a fight.
And he is a zero, not the one and not the zero.
They had a fight that was so important and inspired so many people that it changed the world, because that is what can happen in a story like this. And that's it. Like, there is no real greater implication that like the prophecy was true or that there has to be this. It's a movie that I think The Matrix Resurrections is a movie that I think is really interested in this idea that, maybe Neo was the one, but Zion still ended up falling because that moment was a moment. And what mattered was how that moment got translated into the future, how it is carried forward, which is, I think, the greatest creative kind of emotional purpose for ever continuing a story of this nature, is to say it goes beyond, two icons flying in the air, and it is about what they are fighting for and the people that they are fighting for, which is something that the Matrix sequels, for all of the chagrin that this brings upon them, tried to communicate by like grounding themselves in the real world and in the city of Zion and in those characters. And I think that it's really important that this movie continues to try to bring that forward. I really love, for instance, like what they do with the character of Niobe, who, as Neo directly points out, kind of, you were like a reckless, I'm just going to make the Last Jedi thing. She's Leia in The Last Jedi in this movie.
I've been thinking like, it the entire time you've been speaking, Zach.
It's 100% that, where it's just sort of like you get older and you get wiser and you challenge those ideas. And I think that that's true of like Lana, challenging hers and Lily's ideas from the 90s and early 2000s just a bit, and clarifying the ways that they were always a little bit deconstructed, of ways that they were always a little bit self-critical.
I think the movie's much better off for it too. At least, like, again, I love the original Matrix, and I think I'm a sequels apologist, I guess, but I think they're good movies too, even if they have a lot of issues. But one of the things that has undeniably been a weakness for those movies with me is that sort of like they really lay on that Christ allegory for those three movies, and like I get it. I understand why that's a present element, but it is like, it feels almost antithetical to what the sequels end up doing, in that, you know, it's not V1 or V0, it's A1, it's A0, is that it feels like it keeps kind of insisting on this gravitas that it doesn't really need. And then this movie just does away with it completely. There's none of it, not a single fucking line about that kind of stuff. And that's an undeniable boon for me.
I think what those movies are about is like the psychological weight of what it is like if everyone believes that that's who you are, but you never really even know if that's who you are, which this explores in a really compelling way through Keanu Reeves, who is like more vulnerable than he's ever been in this role, including in the 1999
really fragile
film.
In this movie.
And I love that. I mean, I love that. It brings me so much into the emotional headspace and how kind of harmful our opening 30 minutes was to him. There's just a real sense of emotion, which I think drives every scene of the film. And is its great strength.
Somebody throws a red pill at him and he's like, no. What
a great scene.
Like, that kind of stuff too, is that like they don't entirely abandon the whole idea of just like some of these characters are stuck inside of the Matrix and they are inherently a little bit like emotionally like colder, but you can see that they've definitely grown and changed from then. But there's a lot of personality in this movie that feels a lot more modern and a lot more natural. Like it's all over Yahya Abdul-Mateen's performance, and that like in that bathroom scene where he's just like, oh, hold on a minute, he's having a moment. Like these characters feel as though they are distinctly a bit more human, which goes to show that progression that we were talking about before. It's like the Matrix gets smarter, but also the people get smarter. They get emotionally more intuitive, and like I really love that that's sort of like fed back into like, again, it's so very Last Jedi in its self-reflexiveness, which is, you know, it's a good thing on this particular podcast. If you know, not a good thing if you're a fucking media illiterate loser. But the way it's able to sort of like poke fun at itself and kind of elaborate upon what it is, it's just like, The Matrix is a movie that, like, you know, it has all of these things in it, these cool, like, badass shit and all that stuff. But it's like, it's a movie where the second act low point and like the third act part of it is instigated by true love's kiss. In the scene where that's coming apart, it's like, that is such a deeply emotional image that's just like speaking to the power of everything that is antithetical of machines and cold hardware. And it's just like, this has always been what these movies have been about. You just didn't notice that just because you were so focused on all of this other stuff. But when people come back to these movies, and the reason they've seen that cultural reevaluation is that they can see that through line always being there. That's why I always had a soft spot for Revolutions. It's because half of that movie is like these really interesting philosophical debates between characters, and then just them being together and wanting to not die. And it's like, in that respect, I feel really paid off, because this feels like the logical progression of where you would go after that. Is like, yeah, Neo and Trinity like die at the end of Revolutions, and it's sad and it's tragic and it suits that movie. But it's also like, I don't know, I feel like killing them permanently actually does kind of close more doors than it opens.
This movie, in a weird sort of way, has a holiday spirit in it, because it reflects a little bit of like Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. There's a line that Henwick delivers to Neo. It kind of reminds me of The Force Awakens, where Neo's like reflecting, it doesn't feel like we did anything. It doesn't feel like anything that we did mattered, which is where The Force Awakens starts, right? Like, oh, the Empire is still alive. And she goes, all of it mattered. And I think that has a lot to do with what you're talking about, both the machines and the people improving themselves. Because imagine that you're, you know, a freed mind, and you see what Neo can do, and you go, can I do that? And it inspires you. It inspires you to reach deeper inside of yourself and try these different things, which is why there is more harmony between the machines and the humans. It's why the Matrix is different, for better or for worse. It's this idea that no matter how much time passed, or no matter how cyclical or iterative things seem, it's not because they're rebooting or cycling back into themselves. It's the natural progression of things, and they could not have progressed in the way that they did without you. All of it mattered. And that, I mean, to me, is really powerful. I feel like Lana Wachowski,
we didn't give up, and you're part of the reason why.
And even when we look at films that maybe have flaws to them, or maybe not everybody liked them, it's like, no, but they still were telling a story about these characters, and that's still valid. And I think in terms of our Last Jedi comparisons, that's the strongest comparison that there is that it looks at all the material and says, all of this is good as all of this. It is all as worthwhile as, you know, the stuff that is beloved. And so we're going to carry every single part of it forward as part of this new story.
Yeah, I think that line in particular, just on a purely like dramatic level, where she says all of it mattered, is like Neo is saying that while looking at a person who physically would not be alive if he didn't do it. So it's like, and I love how it's critical of the sort of Messiah complex that Neo packs around for so much of all of these movies, where he's just like, I don't know if I actually.
It's like reminding you, it's like, hey, you're the fourth one, man. Don't get all high and mighty.
I don't know if anything we did mattered. It all looks like shit still. And the person who like 60 years on, if he hadn't negotiated some sort of peace between the machines and Zion, like just would not have been born.
And there's a powerful emotional message there, right? Like it's an antidote to so much cynicism. And I don't want to get all fucking, on my
go there.
horse
Go there,
it,
King.
but like
that's what this movie is about, Tyler.
There's a lot of movies that are happening at the moment that are rooted in a very cynical approach to these kinds of lessons. I'm not going to name any, but this feels like an antidote to that, which is an approach and a feeling that's pervaded a lot of film and media and culture for a while, and a lot of media and culture discussion for a while as well. And so that's what's so beautiful about seeing this and experiencing this and being reminded of what this world has always kind of been about, but having that be so much more beautifully and sentimentally explored than ever before. And so it's a movie that made me feel, just genuinely made my heart swell up to twice its size. And that is exactly what I hoped it would do. And it did it in ways that I could never have expected. And I am eternally grateful that this movie happened, especially that it came at the end of this year to kind of wrap a bow around it, because it's left me feeling like so much better about everything, really. And
that blockbusters can still even be something like this. It's like you get the people like us, and it's like you really think you spend years being convinced that, like, damn, The Last Jedi was a fluke, we're never going to get anything like that shit again. And then Lana's like, bitch, I am still here. Yes, the fuck you are.
And like the thing about that, though, the thing about this movie, and I guess it's true of The Last Jedi as well, is like these are films that take elements of conventional blockbusters, like the kind of like humorous aside moments, or the like supporting characters who are there more as kind of like comic foils but have a kind of heart of gold sort of thing. You have these little elements that are like pervasive and like just basically part of the formula of yay blockbuster, every single one of them, but they feel so much more rooted in sort of genuine human beings or people, or like genuine personalities here. They feel like they have such a greater emotional groundwork than, when that kind of archetype is just applied in a cut and paste blockbuster.
That young girl character who is on loan from Revolutions, like she's back as like an adult, all she really does is kind of like info dumps and then like explains how they're gonna do the third act thing. And that feels so heartfelt, that she's sitting there ruminating like about her father's, dying act was to like create this thing that weaponized love against two people whose love inspired him to create it in the first place. And you're like, just that little bit inside of like just kind of a, hey, look at this guy type of cameo that every movie does. And it's mined for the maximum amount of pathos every single time that they do it. It's not done to, whack you with a stick and be like, ha, nostalgia, ha. It's that character has my favorite line in any of these movies and Revolutions, where he says, no, love is a word, it's the connection that it implies. And it's like, that's what the movie is. That's it. And so Jake, like the idea that he is the one that devises the Neo Trinity pod prison that kind of like Monsters Incorporated style, I guess, like mines their love for each other, like their innate desire and pull towards each other for like energy or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the idea that he is the person that makes that person, that program that is like ruminating on the human emotion of love is like, bruh, that's really cruel. That's really evil and malicious. And those are the types of things that have always existed in these Wachowski scripts, in my opinion, where there are these flourishes of character psychology that connect to the larger emotional story that is being told. And that's what keeps any of them from ever feeling like messy or disjointed to me, because they always have a kind of really fluid and legible emotional through line, every single one of their films, no matter how much I like it or dislike it.
The plot and the characters kind of shared the even burden of the previous 3 Matrix movies, whereas here it's like the plot is Neo. That's the plot of the movie. It's Neo trying to get back Trinity, and like that's it. It has a way more personal and defined set of stakes that really make all of these moments. They're like, there are little moments that are definitely like, I wouldn't necessarily call them fan service, but like the emotional through line is so well maintained that whenever you get a little bit of that, it feels wonderful. Like the fight between Groff and Keanu Reeves in this is fucking awesome. I mean, like it's a cool fight in and of itself, but like there are so many like little winks and nods that are like, they're winks and nods, but they're altered a little bit. They're updated, and each time they happen, and I noticed them, I was just like, man, I'm like feeling shit.
I think specifically of like the bird's eye shot where Groff is just like punching him like this, and it's like the hands are going all, and I'm like,
this isn't the Groff
so
fight,
dope.
but I think my favorite little callback shot is the one from beneath the helicopter as the shells are raining down on top of the camera, which is just like a shot that really captivated my imagination when I was 8 and saw The Matrix. I was like, wow.
It knows what parts of those things to hone, and I really appreciate that. It doesn't ever feel empty, or like even just like whenever Groff and Reeves interact in this movie, it's like I never once am not convinced that that's really Smith in there, and just their kind of back and forth of like you know, they're enemies, but they're not really like committed to the fact. It's like you're an obstacle, you're not like an arch nemesis or anything.
I think my favorite moment like that, where it sort of evokes certain things from the previous trilogy, it's not even like a visual sort of callback, it's purely score, and it's the best scene in the movie and the best scene of cinema in 2021 in my opinion, is in the climax when they take that leap and Trinity is the one that's flying.
Oh my fucking god, dude.
Those horns are going, and I feel everything, because like the moment in the original Matrix when Trinity kisses Neo and then he gets up and just dominates the agents, like even like the ultimate diss of not even looking, still blocking all your attacks. It's like, and that music is playing, and it's the greatest scene in film history. And they do something that powerful again with the same music when Trinity is flying instead of Neo, and I'm like,
I always hated that name. That's another one.
When she drops the "My name is Trinity," I was like, oh, that's it.
Hooting, hollering, hooting, hollering, hooting, hollering.
It's like, you motherfuckers are done.
I love that the entire like the crux, the crux of that film happens during a conversation that Neo and Trinity have at a bistro coffee table, basically. Mm-hmm. That's the climax. Like everything that happens after that is like this really bodacious series of action, spectacle, matrixy things happening where they're trying to race against time and survive. But the moment, just like that kiss was the moment. I mean, it's just the two of them having a conversation with each other across from the table. And I think that that's something that is a little maybe understated in terms of like what Wachowski is about, because we think of their films as being so bombastic and full of, you know, action set pieces and creative ideas and wacky visualizations. But a lot of times things just kind of boil down to really simple emotional moments.
That actually sort of like touches into like the at least one thing that we haven't really spoken on, that at least I just kind of feel like I'm in my own kind of matrix and feel like everybody else is asleep when I read shit like this. But like, I the action in this movie is definitely more like restrained, kind of like you were saying. That's, you know, there's a little bit more of a rein in on it. It's not as like obviously wuxia or anime inspired as those original three Matrix movies are. But even from people who like this movie, there's a prevailing sentiment that they say that the action sucks. And I'm sorry, but no, I like, is it as impressive as those three Matrix movies originally? No. Is it trying to be like those? Not even a little bit. It is impressive in a completely different way. I think that these action scenes are satisfying. They get the job done. There's great scene geography in it. All of it's really immediate. There's a lot of really good wides and stuff in it. There's a lot of good CG incorporation. Not all of it is as in camera as those stuff, but it's like, it's just not doing the same kind of excellent that you're used to seeing, in my opinion anyway.
The one thing that I think is missing, there's two things. One, the fight choreographer of the original three films did not choreograph the fight scenes of this film. So as you say, it does not have the same level. That's also the fight choreographer of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So admittedly, that's a loss. What are you going to do? It also isn't shot by Bill Pope. It's different. But what I
believe most of the action sequences, at least on the very first one, were all shot by second unit directors. And I think
that's interesting.
That sort of, and Lana specifically directed all of the action sequences in this one. And especially when you consider that it's her first time, at least I think, doing Matrix-esque set pieces on her own, essentially.
Better than other big budget shit I've seen this year. I can tell you 100%. That much.
I think Jesus Christ.
I think the main thing that is sort of missing, if I would critique this film in any way, it is that, there's a point when like the exile programs show up in this movie, and that's such a great bit of Reloaded. One of the things that's really intriguing about it, of course, is like those two ghost characters who can kind of like phase shift in and out of things. There's a real legibility to sort of the superpowers of particularly the two Matrix sequels, particularly Reloaded, that is kind of missing here, where it's just a lot of characters that kind of shoot guns, shoot guns, force field, jump up high. And that's fine. I think that some of that creativity of like the legibility of like this character has this particular unique ability is kind of like, it kind of leaves me wanting. But that's about the only action note. And I really think that, I pray to God, give me more sequels. If there are sequels to this that have any sort of like real world hover ship type action, all that stuff's going to go way harder than the
I think
movies.
that the door is definitely left open quite ambiguously for more films, which I think is quite pointed the way that it's done. Like this
because it's the same ending as the first movie.
Well, yeah, exactly. But also like I did also read on Wikipedia just before this that apparently Warner Brothers have said they would be interested in doing more with Lana. So,
please,
it seems entirely possible. Just on the note of the action, I found it incredibly compelling. I admittedly haven't seen the original three in a while, so I wasn't doing as many kind of active comparisons in my head, but I thought that the visual choreographing of the action was excellent. I found particularly the sequence where the bots are all kind of just like suiciding out the window.
There's so many cool ideas like that too. It's like it kind of makes up for that by kind of like putting elements that are into the world building of this, of being like, oh, they can do this now too.
Yeah. And
I'm not denigrating. I think that the action is at least as good as the action that you would see in Villeneuve's Dune. Like the blade fighting in that film.
Yes,
it's at least
which is great.
At that level, and that's not a movie that I've seen anyone criticize the action for. Yeah. So miss me.
Yeah.
When I watched The Force Awakens, a movie that I love, and when I watched The Last Jedi, a movie that I love, I think that certain things in their modern cinematic grammar can be superior to the original trilogy. And these are things like lightsaber fights that can be like a little bit more tightly choreographed and have better CG and things, but nothing compares to the way the dogfights look in A New Hope, right? Like there's just something that is always kind of, I don't want to say always, it's just that like what the Matrix movies was special for the way that they were made. this is a different movie in a different era, and it's
Yes.
got a different appeal to it. And I can certainly understand like feeling like there's a bit of a trade-off, but really when you compare it to, as Tyler was saying kind of right up at the very beginning, when you compare it to the slate of other modern blockbusters, I think the action in this is like as good as anything else, and it's way more inventive. It's very legible. The way that it's shot and lit is very like readable. So even though I don't necessarily think that it's got like the highest, like, in my opinion, from this year, No Time to Die is like a better blockbuster with like better, more polished set pieces. And then that's it. That's the only one that I would put above it, period.
Yeah, and the thing about No Time to Die is it's the best set piece vehicle since Mission Impossible Fallout, and that was the best set piece vehicle since Ghost Protocol.
Which was the best one since Casino Royale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It's of a very rare tier of polish and acumen when it comes to set piece creation.
I think we've touched on, is there anything that anyone hasn't talked about yet?
I think the one thing that maybe we need to talk more about would be like Carrie-Ann Moss. That's like the one thing. She's so important. And while Morgan has touched on the gravity of her moment, I don't think any Matrix movie up to this point has been as interested in Trinity, in Trinity's interior, what Trinity represents symbolically, and how god awfully hot Carrie-Ann Moss is.
Oh my
in this
god.
Role. My god.
The biggest problem that I have with this movie is that there is a lot more, I feel anyway, there's a lot more talking about Trinity than there is actual Trinity, and it serves a purpose, but we are also in very real danger of never getting another one of these. So, I don't want to leave unfulfilled.
I agree with you, though I actually have that problem to a greater degree with Reloaded, and that it feels like that movie tries to center her and then ends up just being about Neo's connection to her rather than her. And which is fine, it's good. It's good, but I want Carrie-Ann.
And that
I want
and that's also a great point of clarification that this movie does, is that it recontextualizes the fact that Neo was never the one until Trinity kissed him, and that was never something that anybody focused on other than the fact to say that it feels abrupt and came out of nowhere, which I mean, maybe then, but it doesn't now because this movie made those movies better. Fuck you.
Yes, exactly.
What it presents is that their love is the antidote to false binary. When somebody gives you a choice between A or B, they choose each other. If somebody says Neo got shot, he's going to die, they choose each other. If somebody says, if you go to save your girlfriend, Zion's going to be destroyed, they choose each other. And it's just that over and over and over again. It's just kind of breaking down. It's the fact that when you have somebody like that, you see through the system, you see the code in the clouds, right? You see how everything is false, how this is the only damn thing that really matters or that really drives anything. And I think that
true non-binary cinema. Thank you, Lana.
All the way through all three movies, and that's really the value of this story to me.
All right, let us know what you think of The Matrix Resurrections. How do you feel it holds up? Were you pleased with it? Were you disappointed with it? What did you think of our points in our discussion as well? Did that impact the way that you see the movie? We'd love to hear what your perspective is in the comments below. So please let us know. And yeah, thank you for watching. We will be back with another one of the 2021-2022 film discussions, even whenever the inspiration strikes us. So stick around for that. We have more content coming very soon as well. I believe our next video is on the discography of Opeth, which I'm sure will have a lot of overlap with fans of the Matrix series.
They look in the 90s, they were fucking smoking weed and buying leather, and they were listening to this. They were listening to Opeth after they saw Matrix. So
sure.
yes.
Yeah. All right. Rock over London, rock on Chicago. Microsoft, where do you want to go today?